So I said, well, here's what we do in this state is 2 physicians can sign for futile care, or I can sign, power of attorney signs, and I will sign underneath. And she's emotional, and she says, yes, please bring it out. So she signed, and then I signed right after. And the minute I did the stroke, his monitor went from dee-dee, 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 dee, and it just flatlined. And she turned around and looked at me, and she goes, what did you just do? And I looked at her and I said, it wasn't what I did. It was what you did. Because obviously he's been waiting for you to let him go. And she says, well, what do I do now? And I walked her into his room at his bedside and I put her hand on his and I said, you tell him you love him and you'll meet him in heaven one day.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. Life and death exist side by side every day in the ER. Veteran ER physician and life philosopher David Talbott has spent almost 30 years in those trenches. In this episode, David shares what he's learned about how to live well, how to die well, and how to use mortality to your advantage. But it's not just his time in the ER that has taught David what he shares with us today. His personal life has had its fair share of heartache and tragedy. And David draws vulnerably from those experiences too, as he exhorts us to make the most of our one and only lives. My exhortation to you: don't let this episode go in one ear and out the other, or simply entertain your curiosity about what it's like to do the work that David does. It's more than dramatic stories from the front lines of medicine. It's a study in the human condition, derived from one man's encounters with thousands of people staring death in the face. Someday, maybe even someday soon, you will stare death in the face. Paint yourself into these stories. Imagine that it's you approaching your final breath. Pull mortality close and accept its inevitability. Let David's hard-won wisdom sink deep into your soul and show up in the way you live, so that when it's your time to die, you can die courageously, graciously, and free of regrets. All right, let's dive in. David, in a recent email you wrote me, you said, and I quote, "This whole journey has been about me learning ways to cope with the challenges of life that we all have, rising to be the best I can be with grace, humility, and dignity." I want our listeners to know that the perspective you'll share today is not just an intellectual exercise for you, that the things you'll share today have been hard-won in a crucible of your own experience. And so I wonder, would you be willing to share a couple of the specific challenges of life that have shaped your journey thus far?
I grew up in a very supportive family. And almost like I always joke, my mother was June Cleaver and I lived in Mayberry. And you think that that's this Norman Rockwell life that you're supposed to have. And I think it was Mike Tyson that said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. And that's one thing is life is difficult. Life is hard. And it's supposed to be that way because this allows us to show our greatness, allows us to endure through these challenges, is build our character, and really resonate with our fellow human beings. And for me, I gravitated toward medicine. I ended up a little over 30 years in medicine now, about 27-ish or so in the emergency department. And death is something I see on a frequent basis, as well as in my own life is I have 2 children. That one was born with a condition called cystic fibrosis, and it's a very debilitating disease, and it's the most common life-shortening genetic disease for Caucasians in America. My other child, because we wanted to make sure we didn't have a secondary child with this debilitating disease, we did in vitro and made sure that he did not have these genetic markers. And he ended up being born at 24 weeks, a micropreemie, 1.89 pounds, ended up in a NICU for about 107 days and about 78 of that intubated, which is on a breathing machine. And the reality is 3 times they came to us and said, you know, your child is probably not going to make it, so just brace yourself. And if he survives, he'll be extremely mentally retarded and have significant physical or cerebral palsy or physical agility deficits. And he survived through all that. He's still nonverbal, but he's a beautiful little boy, and he's very agile and loves to create art every day with Play-Doh, and with he just draws constantly. And so it's been beautiful to watch him grow. And then his mother, about 3 to 4 years ago now, ended up with cancer, with metastatic disease, and it has been a long journey of chemo, radiation, multiple surgeries, and a lot of those did not go well. So she's with that struggle, is hopefully nearing the end of the main hump of that. So this is real for me. It's not just as being a physician at bedside and watching people struggle with this denial that they can't believe that, I always say that, one day of your life, you realize you have no more days left to do the things you wanted to do, to tell the people you love them, to resolve those issues that you hope that you had been able to, the conflicts in your life that you had been able to come to a resolution. And so to me, this is about living every moment and having a lot of gratitude and realizing how precious life is, how short it is, and how you can optimize how you live. So, and I would say with my journey and with your journey is I call it intellectual property theft. And what I mean by that is we think our lives are so unique. And the reality is there's nothing I'm going to share with you today that I haven't stole from somebody else and looked at their journey and their life. And the reality is you can try and recreate the wheel, or you can look at all the other people that had similar challenges and how they survived and how they went forward and brought out the best of them instead of the worst. I mean, life is an ongoing story, and you can be bitter about what life has given you, and you become a victim of it and feel like, somehow life screwed you. Or you can turn around and say, wait a minute, this is a chance for me to grow. And instead of being bitter, you get better. And that resonates with others around and inspires them with their challenges.
Gosh, as a parent, I think about, I can't fathom what it must have been like to have had your second child in intensive care of some variety for 100 and some odd days, and to have thought multiple times that the child wasn't going to survive. That must have just been, humanly speaking, just a really brutal and trying experience. And so anyway, I just as a parent, my heart's bleeding as I think about that experience for, the first 100 and some odd days of life with your child, and not knowing if they're going to continue, and to then have the gift of your child surviving, with challenges. But I loved the way that you described him and said he's a beautiful boy with gifts and artistic abilities, nonverbal, but beautiful nonetheless. And it just strikes me that I wonder where it came from, your resolve, if it was a function of a moment, or if it was something you evolved over time to, as you said, rather than get bitter, get better, to rather than grieve the loss of the child that you might have had, learn to appreciate the child that you do have with his limitations and his gifts. What do you think it is that's allowed you to continue to focus on the better, not bitter part?
I think that when you look at life, you can say, why me? But the reality is why not you? And when we look at a couple hundred years ago, women lived into their 30s, men about 42, and the elders of the community, the wise ones, were in their 60s. We live in a time which the year 2030, over half of our adult population will be over the age of 65. That's never occurred in history. And so what I look at is both my children and my wife would be dead in their other, so I can sit there. And when I was working in a clinic in Detroit, I saw these cystic fibrosis children. And at the time, the therapeutics were limited, and most of them lived to be 8, maybe 12 in that era. But I made a promise to myself to never waste one moment of his life grieving over what I didn't have, because that's wasted time. And I figured if and when he dies prematurely, that there'll be plenty of time to grieve afterwards. But why waste that instead of making sure he realizes his life has a purpose? It's so important. He's here for a reason. And, I love Mark Twain said, two most important days of your life, the day you're born and the day you figure out why. And that's the thing we race after every day is, why am I here? And we've been asking that from the beginning of time. And so I look at both my children and their mother. They have a reason for being here, and myself. What is that? And the reality is if you have cancer and you're able to survive that, or you have other debilitating disease and we are able to get to the other side of that, the reality is from the day we're born, we're all a statistic waiting to happen. We just haven't been introduced to the lethal details. So, watching my friend die of cancer, my best friend, I realized if God healed him of that he would die of something else down the road. And certainly I wasn't ready to let him go, but God was ready to take him. And so I had that energy wasting in that struggle of why are we dying? There's nobody in this planet. I mean, billions have gone before us and repeated this cycle of life. So I think my biggest message, and why it resonated when I looked at the thing you're trying to do, Andrew, is I think when we face death, it's not morbid. People look at, that's so horrific, and I look in the ER, it's almost like, hey, doc, look at my paperwork. Death, I didn't check that box. I'm pretty sure I don't do that. And I think living in the sense of denial, it doesn't allow us to appreciate how wonderful, magical our time here is. And I think when you face your death, you live a greater, more rewarding life because you realize how precious all these moments are. And a lot of times they sound like cliche, what would you do if this was the last day of your life? And one day it will be. And I think it's so mundane to some of us that it's easy to slip into that. And I look at especially all of the media today, that we don't connect with people as much as we used to. We're more interconnected through our electronic devices and Netflix, and we can live outside our real world, and it inhibits us from really dealing with a lot of the issues we need to. And I think facing your death, all of a sudden, I always imagine the eulogy where, the preacher says Karen was so vibrant and young, her death so unexpected, but the travesty is God took her right in the middle of season 6. She went to her grave never knowing who won American Idol. And that's the thing. When you're on your deathbed, you look at what were the decisions that really mattered, what was most important. And I think for most of us, did you live? Did you love? Did you matter? Did you live the life that God put before you? Did that life make a difference in your family and friends and your circle of influence? And, how did I matter? Was I able to leave this world with a positive imprint, that really does, what we do really does echo into eternity. I call it a legacy pond where our actions have a ripple effect, and good or bad, it does affect those around us.
Something that's coming up for me as you're talking about that is just how intent modern people are, and maybe this has always been true, but I just know in terms of our society, on the preservation of life at all costs. And you'll speak to some of that, I think, later on when we talk about some of your experiences in the ER. But we've become so hell-bent on preserving life at all costs, it seems to me. And there's even whole fields of science I understand that are all about longevity and trying to figure out how to increase human longevity. It strikes me that in our pursuit to increase longevity, often we're not actually living the life that we have right now. We're just trying to extend it into the future as far as we possibly can, which to me seems to be a sad state. Now, I can relate to that on the one hand because, the flavor of anxiety that I deal with has to do with like catastrophic kinds of events robbing me of life, or someone I love robbing them of life. And so I have to manage that temptation to be preoccupied with that kind of stuff on a regular basis. And actually, to your point, that contemplating on mortality is not morbid, I've found that to be precisely true. Contemplating my mortality in an intentional way has been really life-giving to me, because it causes me to more highly value each moment and each day, and the people I'm with, and the things that I'm doing, and the impact that I'm attempting to make. So that comes up for me, and something that I hope this conversation that you and I are having in this podcast will help to unwind a little bit, is this fixation with the preservation of life at all costs so that we can really live the life that we do have, not just try to extend it into perpetuity.
Absolutely, because with that is I see that too many of us focus on longevity and we forget the quality of our lives. We are this get to control how we live, but we don't really get to decide how we die. And we don't know when that moment is, unless I guess we commit suicide. But for the reality is there's so many things that we can't control, but we can control how we live every day. And that's the thing, I call it your best use by date, right? So all products that we can be, healthy, exuberant, and, our intellectual prowess is at its optimum and nimble. And, you may be 85 and still there and still living large, but I've seen many people in their 20s that life's over. And regardless of what they live to 90, it's the quality of your life that is so important. The quantity of your life. I thought it was interesting. I trained in the South, and I used to go through a lot of the old Civil War stories and looking at their stories. And one time I saw, when I was working a job in Tennessee, I saw this Civil War cemetery with a stone that said, this man lived from one date to another. And then underneath it clarified that's 83 years, 4 months, and 12 days. And so I looked at it, this man's like bragging from the grave. But the reality is this is somebody who had lived way beyond past what you would anticipate. And today, an 80-year-old person is a dime a dozen, so to speak, as far as that's, our modern medicine has elongated our lives. But again, not always the quality. And I think that that's really pertinent when I talk to people about, it amazes me how many people don't have advance directive, or what would you want done in the event you couldn't speak for yourself? Would you want heroics performed and put on a machine to breathe for you, and we, put electricity through your heart to restart it if it stopped? And I really think we look at television, gives us a false perception, again, how death is an option in our culture. And that I look at so many movie stars that you see them in one movie, they die, but then 2 weeks later you see them in another movie. Or even if they did die in that movie reruns again and again. And so I think it deludes us into this, again, that death is not right there in front of you. But I think it's important when you look at that many times modern medicine can improve your life. It can increase your longevity. But just at the same time, it also many times increases your pain and suffering. And half of the healthcare dollar spent in the average person's life is spent in the last 2 weeks of life, which is a terrible kind of commentary on our healthcare system, which in my mind is really more of a sick care system. We wait till you're debilitated and frail and something, versus keeping you healthy to begin with, which I think is a lot more of the push of our society. And then let nature take its course when we're ready to die, that I think people can accept that a lot more.
What do you think prevents people from being ready to die when it's apparent that death is approaching, in your experience?
I think a couple things resonate with me. One is their spiritual beliefs. I think so many people, particular to me, if you're an atheist, it's got to be challenging if you think this is it. And I can see why people would focus on just a hedonistic lifestyle, live in the moment. If there's nothing beyond this, why not focus on momentary pleasures? But at the same time, when I think you live a life for things that have longevity beyond your life, you realize, to me, there is something beyond this world. And I look at when people think we're just here by happenstance, I look at just of the amazing machine that we are as humans. We have there's 2 cells, and I think if you look at it, we get 23 chromosomes from one parent, 23 from another. So if you put that into a book and made those 46 chapters, each chapter would have 50 to over about 250 million pages. So you're made out of about 3.2 billion pages of data that tells these 2 cells to replicate into over 100 trillion cells, each with perfectly coordinated with all the other cells. Now, if you took the DNA out of one cell and stretched it out on end, it would be about 6 feet. If you took it out of all your cells, stacked it end to end, it would go to the sun and back over 600 times. So you look at the precision of that, and that when people say we're here by happenstance, I'm always feel like people are welcome to their opinion, but you have to be very poor in statistical analysis to truly believe that. When you look at your brain is over 80 to 100 billion cells that have over 100 trillion connections, or synapses we call them, that fire at about 3 million times a second, and you're only aware of about 2,000 of those. This to me is the most incredible complex computer that's ever been conceived or produced. And to believe that this just happened by mere coincidence, I think is pretty hard when you look at statistical probability. So again, a belief that there's God, that there's something else out there. And I find a lot of my friends who don't believe in God, when they tell me that Mother Nature produced this forest, and I'm going, okay, that just sounds like your name for God, because that is some sort of a creation. There must be a creator in turn that put that in place. I mean, this can't be done with just lackadaisical process. It has to be very precise and very methodical.
And I share your perspective on the existence of a creator from whom we can trace our origins. And I know in my own life, it's what modifies that hedonistic "eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die" impulse into something that has maybe a little more trajectory and purpose and intent behind it, to say, well, much like you were saying earlier, the pond of, did you say the legacy pond? Is that what you called it?
Yeah, I just called it a legacy pond.
To realize that I have some sense of responsibility and obligation, not just to myself, but to humanity, to be the best that I can be, because my life doesn't exist in a vacuum. And what I do in this life does ripple beyond into eternity, not just in future generations, but in the quality of the life that I experience after this one or another. So I share that perspective of mine, and I know that it does apply more meaning and significance to my life than I might otherwise have. And I know that people strive for meaning in their lives through a lot of different sources and ways, and are attempting, as Rob Riggs said on this episode, he's a coroner here in Routt County. He said on this podcast a while back, he said, we're all trying to answer 3 questions. Where did I come from? What am I here for? And what happens next? And those 3 questions, I think, echo in the hearts and minds of men all the time, whether or not we acknowledge them. And it's just a matter of how consciously we're living in an attempt to answer those questions. I'm pushing pause on the interview briefly to bring you some sad news. Dennis Franks, my guest on episode 34, died suddenly on Saturday, October 16th, at the age of 68. He leaves behind his wife, Nancy, who played a life-saving role in Dennis's life-changing encounter with mortality many years ago, 2 grown daughters, and 3 grandkids. I didn't know Dennis well, but the time I did spend with him for the podcast made it clear to me that he had a huge heart and a voracious appetite for life. He was laser-focused on making every day count and making his life matter. He loved his family deeply, and he served thousands in their pursuit of financial independence through his work at Market America, which he saw as more of a mission than a profession. And one thing's for certain, Dennis had a lot more living he wanted to do. If you haven't tuned in to Dennis's episode, I hope you will. After you listen, take a minute to share what his story meant to you on one of my social media posts created in his honor on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach. Life is short, folks. You have a quote. I want to hit on this briefly before we move into talking some more about your experience as an ER physician, because that has significantly influenced the way you view death in life. And it's also significantly influenced, from previous conversations you've shared, what you understand your purpose in this world to be. So, quick question on this quote at the bottom of your email signature. It says, it's a Voltaire quote, and it is, "Life is a shipwreck, but we must not forget to sing in the lifeboats." And I'm just curious, what made that quote, of all the quotes that might have, made the cut to be below your email signature line, why that one? And what's important to you about it?
The thing I think is so important is the quality of our life is predicated so much on what we focus on. It's what our focus is. And I've seen people rise above that. I've seen them in the ER with such travesty and so little resources and do miraculous things. And then I've seen people that have all the resources in the world and are debilitated, but sometimes psychologically, emotionally. And the thing, I remember reading a book one time. I just loved it. It said 40 ways to be miserable. Many of these tactics you're already using. And this was a guy who was a therapist for people who were so depressed, they were clinically depressed to the point they were hospitalized. And it was his job to try and give them the tools to be successful in the outside world again. And he struggled and struggled, and these people were just so set in being depressed. And one day he said, we're going to take a different tactic. Instead of trying to teach you what to do, he says, we're going to have a contest. And next week when we meet, we're going to give $1 million to the person who can figure out the way to be the most miserable. You know, because you guys are here. You guys are very successful at it. You're doing a great job with it. You know, let's see how you can just hone those skills. And one of the ladies spoke up and she said, Doctor, $1 million? She said, up to this point in my life, I've been doing all this for free. The problem is, I know I'm living in hell, but I know all the streets down here. I know my neighbors. I know where to shop for groceries. And that's one of the challenges I think we as humans have, is we're so comfortable in the position we are, and we're bathed in these neurochemicals that keep us set. You know, they call the pain-pleasure principle, that most of what we do in life is predicated on the acquisition of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. The weird thing to me is how many people will spend so much more effort in avoiding the pain than the pleasure. And the reality is there is no growth without friction. You know, you're talking earlier about courage. Courage is not feeling the fear. The courage is feeling the fear, and I think they say saddling up anyways. You know, going forth, putting your gun, pointing it forward and getting out of the foxhole and moving on. And that's the thing I think is so important. I worked with a lot of Angola prisoners in my training, and that's one of the largest security prisons in the federal prison, I think, system. And it amazes me how many people would get out and get back in again, because prison life they're comfortable with. They know, you know, where to shop for groceries. They know the streets there. They know, you know, but this outside world of freedom is so scary to them that a lot of them could never overcome that. And I think that so many times we, as humans, put ourselves in our own prison, and we're the only one with the key, and we don't even realize it. You know, the thing is we've been hurt so many times, and we think life is not supposed to be painful, and we're not supposed to get hurt. And so we're afraid to risk again that we might get hurt again. And the reality is you're going to get hurt again, but having the skills and the character and the reality to figure out that a lot of these things that hurt you have nothing to do with you. We personalize them. You know, they say so many times I've heard is hurt people hurt people. Or on the other hand is another way I like it is those hurts of the past, you either transcend them or overcome them, incorporate them, and learn to be stronger and more resilient. You know, that saying, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so you can be stronger and move forward, or you can let that pain debilitate you and you become a prisoner in your own of your own doing. And that's, to me, is so sad that so many of us in our society have done that.
Maybe an evolution of that hurt people statement can be hurt people can heal people.
Absolutely.
When we're willing to transform our pain and challenges into things that have therapeutic effects in other people's lives. And then, what was the second statement you said? Oh, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think a useful evolution of that one might be what doesn't kill you can make you stronger.
That's true.
And the reason that it can make you stronger is if you're willing to let it. But things that threaten to kill us can also make us weaker if it causes us to shrink back in the face of that thing and to become smaller and to hide. And I think what we're both advocating for here is, you know, life can be a shipwreck, but sing in a lifeboat anyway, press on anyway. And so it brings to mind just probably the the bad expectation that many of us, especially I would say in the Western world, where we are just replete with conveniences and things to kind of amuse us, and we're prone to this expectation that life ought always to be nice and pleasant. And if something goes badly, then there's someone or a resource that will fix my pain, and I'll just keep moving. And in the Western world, I think it's one of the great challenges we have in modernity is realizing, no, it's not like that. We've lived in sort of a 250-year bubble, maybe less than that. I'm not a historian or a son of one, but in the United States, we've been super fortunate in many ways for so long that we've gotten, I don't know, soft maybe, and just gotten soft to the harsh realities of life. And I think what we're both advocating for here is, sort of, to use an old biblical term, I don't know where it came from, gird your loins, put on your armor for battle, because life is a battle. And if you haven't experienced much in the way of hardship or tribulation yet, then, give it a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a few years, it's coming your way. And when it does hit, how prepared will you be? And it struck me that you said there's people in the ER who are very well resourced. And I'm assuming that means in many of the measurable ways, socioeconomically and all those ways, very well resourced in those ways, but then they crash and burn mentally, emotionally, and psychologically in the face of tragedy. Other people who aren't equally as well resourced socioeconomically in other ways, who thrive and rise to the occasion in those moments. And that's just so striking. The gentleman who's on the podcast that actually is airing today, Ryan Baker, is a paraplegic, and he really helped to tease out the idea of what disability really is. In his case, he doesn't have the use of his legs, but he says, I think I'm more fully functional than a lot of people who are walking around out there, who mentally and emotionally and psychologically aren't equipped to deal with life's genuine hardships.
In his case, it's not even a metaphor, but I think so many of us, we're so afraid of death, it paralyzes us, and we become spectators in our own life. And we die at the end of our lives, never, writing that book, never having that relationship, never getting that job or starting that business. And all of these hopes and dreams are on the doorstep, of our life, and they crash. And yet a challenge too, as you said, is we have had it relatively easy compared to so many other people. And there's that statement, that which is gained with a little effort is esteemed of little value. And that's one thing as far as even singing from the lifeboats. When you've been through the shipwrecks of life, all of a sudden you can turn around and say, wow, how much I appreciate this or that. And it is, again, then what you focus on. It illuminates your life and your path and your journey. And when you see people like the gentleman you spoke about who's paralyzed, but not letting him slow him down. He may physically not have as much agility, but mentally he's way ahead of most. And he's taken his shipwreck and helped him to grow and inspire others.
That's interesting. I would just pose that question to all of us, to myself and to all of us listening, just kind of, what has our shipwreck been up until this point in life? Because undoubtedly each of us can think of a situation in life that shipwrecked us somewhat. Maybe not, washed us up entirely up on the rocks and broke the hull apart, but, shipwrecked us in some ways. And what do we learn about ourselves in those moments? Did we find ourselves equipped to deal with that shipwreck, or were we completely undone by that shipwreck or something else? And maybe there's an opportunity for us to revisit that shipwreck moment and integrate it into our story moving forward differently, so that it doesn't become just a blight on our record, but becomes something that can be transformed, not only something that is healing in our own lives, but beneficial to others.
Well, and along with that is, I think that these shipwrecks in our life create some of our habits, our patterns. It's said that by the age of 30, about 95% of what we do is on autopilot. And some of that makes sense. I mean, if you had to decide which side to get it out of the bed every day, where to put your alarm clock, which side am I going to start shaving my face? You get decision fatigue. But there's a lot of other things that, what time I get out of bed, what do I do first thing in the morning? How do I interact with others? I love that saying, the chains of habit are too light to feel till they're too heavy to break. And the thing is when we get in these shipwrecks, I can't spell, I can't write a book. That may be, you always have some deficit in your brain, and that's still your shipwreck. You were embarrassed when you got up and tried to recite something or spell something or do something, and you've let that be an anchor on your life. versus wind in your sails to say, wait a minute, I can spell, I can write a book, I can be a Pulitzer Prize winner. And you use it to inspire you to go forward.
I love that contrast between an anchor versus wind in your sails. That's a great that works for me a lot to think of, what parts of my story are anchors for me still versus fresh wind in my sails. And the funny thing is that the things that are currently anchors are the very things that can become the most powerful and freshest wind in our sails if we'll allow it. But it just takes the willingness to see that. I want to turn to your career as an ER physician, and you're a veteran of 27 or so years in the ER, which means, oh my gosh, so many hundreds and thousands of different scenarios you've seen, from my son going in to get stitches in his forehead after we were chasing each other around the house and he hit a table, the mundane to, I would imagine, the most catastrophic you could imagine. How has your ER experience, and this is a super broad question, but I just want you to riff on it and go with what comes to mind. How has your ER experience shaped your views on death and life?
There's something I like to think is you can come to the ER in a Lamborghini or take a taxi, but we all eventually leave in a Hearse. And every day I work, I'm reminded of that. And I call it the good side of the glass. I'm not a patient, and the right side of the grass. So when I'm tired and fatigued and, it's really challenging, I can complain and be downtrodden, or I can say, wait a minute. I get to be here. I don't have to be here. I get to be here every day. I get to serve every day. Every day I walk out of this hospital, I'm not the best physician that's ever walked the planet. And, you're never perfect, but I know at least one person that day I made a positive impact on their life. And you hope every patient experience, but that, just isn't realistic. But the reality is I get to engage with people and deal with their fears. Because even though I've had people with the simplest of wounds, and yet it's debilitating for them, and, I try and meet them where they are and help, sometimes I call it talk them off the edge of the bridge or whatever, It's a great job in that I do have that impact in people's lives, and all the way to people dying that you think is a tragedy, and from the outside it looks like such a terrible way. And so many people are ready to go. It's okay. I remember this one patient early on in my practice, and I was a resident in Deep South, and he had laryngeal cancer, and he had a lot of his voice box cut out, and he talked through this little speaker that he put through his throat. And then later he got another type of infection. We had to go in because of all the gangrene. The surgical team I was on basically debribe or cut away a lot of this tissue and give him antibiotics and treatment. And there was multiple debilitating surgeries. And I remember one day looking at him, because I was the first year resident. So you kind of do, we call the scut work, and I'm doing all the notes. And I got a little choked up. He could see I was struggling, because I could see he was suffering so much and he was about to die. And this day, he was the teacher. He reached out and touched me and said, it's okay. It's okay. I've fought this so long, and I've suffered so much, and I'm ready to go. And he made it all okay. So that's the thing, is you see people handling the most difficult times with grace and eloquence, and then I see other people that are just mad at the world and angry that, they have cancer, or they have this, or they have that, and think that somehow God has left them, or God is cursing them. And so talking people through, and I think there was a special case I had in Louisiana.
Can I pause real quick?
Sure.
And just jump in, because I could tell you were feeling emotionally as you recalled that experience of that gentleman with the laryngeal cancer and all of the pain and suffering going through. What changed for you in that moment? And it brings back that emotion as you think about it. What was that moment about for you in your own journey?
Here I was as the physician, supposed to be strong and help him through it, and he's the one that helped me.
How did he help you? What did he give you that you needed?
Highlight that in life, it's not so much when and how you die, it's how you live. He lived on his terms. Even when death was looking him in the face, he wasn't afraid. And he didn't feel victimized. He didn't say, like, why do I have to die? And people go, and it's like, We all die, you know? It's like, it's not a choice. And yet so many people think it is. And this guy said, no, this is part of the process. And I've been waiting for this for a long time. And I think that's too many times we forget to get on a human level with our patients. And it brings up another case. I recall that this guy came in is about 4 years ago, and he had basically quit breathing. His heart had stopped, and his wife called the ambulance, and they were able to defibrillate him or shock his heart and start him breathing again. And he shows up at the hospital, and he's one of the angriest patients I've had in a long time. And I walked him to his room, and he, with expletives, says, what are you people doing? You know, he said, look, I have fought this battle for 10 years. He's had like 12 or 14 stents in his heart. You know, he had like a litany of surgeries. He had multiple things. And he says, look, I'm done. I have this do not resuscitate, make me comfortable. And my wife knows that, but she doesn't want to lose me. And so she panicked and called the ambulance when she should have just left me to pass. And the thing for me that I've been able to do with that is I said, and I'm not the type of physician that I say, here's what you're going to do and here's what I'm going to provide. I say, what do you want? And I just, with him, I said, well, what would you have me do? He says, look, I just want to go home and die. And I have sit in my lounge chair, and I have this little dog that sits on my lap, and I love this dog, and I want this dog just to climb in my lap, and I want to pass away peacefully. And I said, let's do that. And I got him loaded up and got him back home. And that's the thing for me, is in medical school, they teach you everything to keep people alive at all costs. And it's really the wrong message. And I hope that, eventually we do less of that and still focus on that quality of that person's life and let them to decide. And it's hard, because I've had patients that you think their quality of life is terrible. Well, as long as they have one hand left and they can hit a clicker and watch television, they're okay with that that's a quality of life, and they can interact maybe with their family. And the next person, if they can't mountain bike 20 miles a day, life is terrible. And so you have to let them to decide their quality of life and not impose your rating system, as it were, on that process.
Well, and thank you for sharing more about how that interaction with that gentleman as a first-year resident impacted you. And it sounds like it's significantly informed the way you've interacted with patients on the fine line between life and death ever since. And you're about to share another story that you've given me some insight into before. Go ahead and share it. It's I think it was also when you were a resident. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It was the last year or two I was in a residency, and the most difficult month for us as residents is our ICU month, and you're basically up 36 hours about every fourth day. And, you're running on fumes. It was back in the days of the pager was just invented, So we thought that was great. You didn't have to stick around by a phone, but at the same time, it was
It was on your hip.
your kind of ball and chain. Absolutely. So I had been up 20 some hours, and I just wanted to grab a quick nap. And I remember getting the call to come back to the ICU. Now, as a resident in that capacity, I was only charged with taking care of my attendings patients. And if there was a code blue, or somebody was to quit breathing or their heart stopped, that you went down and ran those codes. So I was called from the ICU, and someone asked me about this patient, which I recalled because there's a notable celebrity, and he was part of that family. And instead of showing up in an ambulance, he showed up in a limousine to our ER. So my colleagues downstairs said that the daughter taking care of him insisted that he be intubated and keep him alive at all costs. So that's what they did. She was the power of attorney or executor. So the nurse upstairs asked me if I knew, let's just call him Mr. Brown. Do you know about Mr. Brown? I said, yes, ma'am, I do. And I said, what can I do for you? Because is he my attending patient, Dr. Shabani, or is he, is he coding, or is there some? She said, no, every once in a while he has these erratic heartbeats, which we call PVCs. And I was sitting there thinking about, well, how many? Are they, lethal or not? And they really weren't. They're just casual dysrhythmia that a lot of us can go to, some coffee shop and have a few of these and we'll never know it. So I'm thinking this is a new nurse or something. And she says, he doesn't have a DNR, a do not resuscitate order. And he had had a stroke 3 years ago. So he had been in bed for 3 years. And with the celebrity's money, had been able to take care of him he had no flexion contractures, he had no breakdown in his skin, very well taken care of. And she said, now has an intubated or a tube in his throat breathing for him. And I think that this patient should be, a DNR. And the primary care physician has talked to the daughter for 3 years and she won't sign it. So in my mind at the time, I'm thinking, look, I've been up for hours. This isn't my patient. It's 3 a.m. This is a primary care physician discussion. And this little nurse was kind of a bulldog. And I finally said, ma'am, do you need me to come down and talk to this daughter? And she said, please, if you would. So I came down to her and I said, you understand from the moment we're born that we all have an expiration date. It's the same as it was over 1,000 years ago. And I understand that you're this gentleman's power of attorney and his daughter. And it looks to me like you've done a wonderful job taking care of him. For someone who's been debilitated this long, he's in wonderful shape. But I said, you understand what a power of attorney does? And she says, yeah, I get to make all the decisions. And I said, well, not actually. You get to make decisions for your father if he's unable to do so, but with the caveat that you're to make the decisions he would want if he could speak for himself, not what you want. Because the reality is, none of us want our father or mother to die as a general rule. And at the same time is too many people feel like they are in control of that if they signed a DNR that they've somehow killed this person, which isn't correct either. It's a courageous thing to do to allow somebody to die with dignity and grace. And I said, at this point, I want you to look in your heart of hearts and ask yourself, what would your father say if he could speak for himself? And she just burst out crying. And I thought, wow. And she's, oh my God, he wouldn't tolerate this for 1 minute. And I said, really? So the thing your father would want you to do is just make him comfortable. She said, of course. So I said, well, here's what we do in this state is, 2 physicians can sign for futile care, or I can sign, power of attorney signs, and I will sign underneath. And she's, a little emotional, and she says, yes, please bring it out. So she signed, and then I signed right after. And the minute I did the stroke, his monitor went from dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, and it just flatlined. And she turned around and looked at me and she goes, what did you just do? And I looked at her and I said, it wasn't what I did. It was what you did. Because obviously he's been waiting for you to let him go. And she says, well, what do I do now? And I walked her into his room at his bedside. And I put her hand on his and I said, you tell him you love him and you'll meet him in heaven one day. And I went back up to my call room and I realized how much of my life is I'm just a tool to provide a message for people in need and to do it in a graceful way that they can understand. And I don't know how I came up with half of that stuff living on fumes and the right answers for her, but they were, so I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, right. What a moment. It sounds like it really shaped the way you think about your job as an ER physician. That, yes, of course, you're diagnosing and you're applying medical interventions and those kinds of things, but sometimes, and maybe more often than for other doctors in the ER, you're there as a counselor and someone to help others allow death into their life in a way that they've been resisting and to make a transition.
Well, and honesty is the many times of the medical profession, we write checks we can't cash. I recall a patient that was sent to me not too long ago that had metastatic pancreatic cancer. And they were trying just one last chemotherapeutic. And she showed up in my ER. And I didn't know whether I was going to call the hospitalist to admit her to the ICU or the morgue. And I looked at the family and I said, what's the end game here? I mean, she has been through so much pain and suffering, and the reality is chemotherapeutics, 70% of them don't increase your life expectancy one day. And that's the challenge, is that a lot of these, we give people false hope. And, physicians, we're taught to heal and we don't want anybody to die. But that's not realistic. And I think a lot more of physicians is I feel my goal is to walk them through the process. And I shouldn't be having these DNR discussions at bedside. Should have been done a long time ago with the whole family. And I would encourage anybody who is listening to this is talk to your family and friends. In the event of your succumbing to some potentially lethal injury or disease, and you're unable to speak for yourself, be real clear, because there's a lot of guilt that is shouldered by your survivors and feel like they don't know the right choice. And, do you want cremated? Do you want traditional burial? Do you want put on a vent? Do you not? Let people know up front so everybody is in agreement, and it just saves so much pain and suffering in the long run.
How does your mortality mindset impact the way that you live day to day? And you talk a lot about how important it is to you to live intentionally. So in David Talbott's life, someone who's been on the front lines between death and life for 27 years as an ER physician, also has experienced tragedies in your own personal life with your wife's cancer battle, the challenges that your two sons have. How does this actually change the way you live?
Well, I realize life is really a mind game. And I think the most important conversations are the ones you have with yourself in the mirror every day. Because the reality is, your fears, failures, faults, and, your mind has the tactical advantage because you can't lie to yourself, right? You can lie to the rest of the world. And it amazes me how many people are fine living a lie, projecting a persona of themselves that's not true. And they're okay with that versus exposing who they really are and being accepted for the person they are. And to me, that is the pinnacle of human relationship. I always feel we have that with our Creator. He knows you in and out, but having another person that knows you on that level, and it's enlightening when you find the people you're with are truly human and they have those same challenges. And we think 60 to 70,000 thoughts a day. The majority of those, about 80%, are the same thoughts we had yesterday, and the majority of those are negative. And most of us, if we talk to ourselves, our family and friends, the way we talk to ourselves is that they wouldn't hang out with us. And 60% of what we're worried about is in the past. We can't control it. 30% is in the future and never comes to pass. And so I think of really focusing on how can I help me be successful as possible to optimize my life is sitting down. And I love the serenity prayer, regardless of your religion or lack thereof, is if you look at, grant me the wisdom, basically the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and, the courage to change the things I can. So if you're worrying about something, and if it's not in your bucket to change, then you got to let it go. You say, God, that's yours. And the things that are, quit worrying about it, get off the couch and do something about it. But the most important thing is the wisdom to know the difference. And we forget that. And so I think for me is realizing that we have the focus of our mind, what we think about, we become. And trying to sit down and say, what are the positive and wonderful things in our lives? Not have a thought process of lack, but have a thought process of abundance, of gratitude. And we can always find blessings in our lives. And when you look at those blessings, and I like to write those down and keep them in my pocket, or certain things I want to think about during the day, I write little notes and put it in my pocket. And when I'm kind of struggling or I'm distracted, I pull those out.
What's on those notes, Dave? What are you writing down? What are you capturing that encourages you?
Some of those are, I look at words that I want to aspire to: integrity, courage, grace, humility. Those are words I want to define me. And I really think and encourage people to actually write your own obituary. It seems a little narcissistic to some people, but the reality is, if you don't have a goal, you're never going to get there. And, they talk about the gateway to heaven is narrow, and I look at that success 101. You can't get anywhere unless you focus your attention on this is what success looks like. This is what begin with the end in mind. When I get to the end of my life, what will I want said to me about me? How did I live? How did I interact? Well, I write those down and hope, and that every day that these are the things I aspire to, and how can I be better and be the best version of myself every day. And I get to the end of the day and I go, oh, I did really good on that one, and kind of tripped and stumbled on that one, and just kind of regroup and say, with God's blessing, how can I get up tomorrow morning and work to be a better person? And because at the end of your life, you realize you're the only one in the race. It's not about anybody else. You get to the end of your life, it's you looking in the eyes of God, and what did you do with the talent I gave you? What did you do with, all those gifts? And I really think to whom much is given, much is expected. And that's what, to me, is where we are to atone for the things that we let the ball drop, and we're, appreciated for that talent that we use the way God wanted us to.
That motivates the heck out of me, just that idea of, using what I've been given to the best of my abilities, and understanding there's an accounting to be given for how I use that really motivates me a lot, in a positive, very positive sense. I mean, not in a fear, not really in a fear-driven way, like, oh no, there's going to be an accounting, but more like, no, I've been given a responsibility to do with myself as much as I can while I'm still drawing breath. And it brings to mind, if we're always pushing to be the best and to maximize and to optimize, we might be led to think that there's no rest or recreation or just enjoyment of the present moment. And I don't think that's true in your life, though, David. So I'm curious, what's the recipe in your life in terms of pushing to be the best, to optimize, to maximize, and also, if they're at all in competition with one another, to enjoy your sons, to enjoy recreational activities you enjoy, and just to enjoy the present moment? How do you manage that tension?
I think the biggest thing for me is it's so important to be a wonderful influence on my sons. And the reality is their mother and I have been divorced, and that even has added an extra element of challenge. And the thing is that, that you feel like that's a failure, that the two of us didn't have the ability to live a happy, healthy life and didn't have the skill set. And the thing is we can always look at any of our relationships that don't work, and we can blame the other person. And I think what has always motivated me is say, wait a minute, whether those relationships breaking down are 5% my fault or 95%, I got to own that percent. And if I don't, I'm going to transmit this into my next relationships and, of different types of relationships. And so it inspires me always to get better every day. And I try and read a book, at least a new book every week. And I try to pick different genres, different things about, again, how other people have gone through these challenges, and never, ever feel like, my children, I want them to know they are not a victim. They have they still have choice. They may have challenges, but they have blessings, and they focus on that. And I want my children always for me to inspire them. And there's four little eyes that look at me all the time, and I know they're a blessing. And like I said before, I know in most other countries, both of them would be dead. And so I say, hey, what can I do with what I have? And again, it's that end run that I feel I have been blessed so much. I have a wonderful family. And, the book in the Bible, as far as talents, I believe I'm one of those guys with 10 talents. And so it isn't for me to sit back and say, I have been blessed so much. It's to me to sit down and say, hey, how can I share? How can I make the world a better place for me being here and have the biggest impact? And when I watch people die and go through death, and even when I don't see somebody die, I see people's health just whittled away all the time. And it's amazing how many of the elderly people and I'm just saying even over 60, live alone anymore. That's a terrible commentary on our society. I think at the end of our days, it's these relationships with people that matter the most. And that's the most important thing, And so that's what I look at the end of the day is they say discipline is weighed in ounces, but regret in pounds. And I want to live a life without any regrets.
Ditto, here, here. And I asked that question somewhat selfishly because it's something I'm really kind of newly wrestling with a little bit as I understand cerebrally that relationships the most important thing, and also have a job to fulfill and people to serve through my job, and work to do in the world apart from my family that exists apart from my family. And I'm wrestling a lot with kind of the tension between being and just enjoying the present versus pushing forward and stretching the frontiers of my existence for the benefit of the world around me. And so I ask somewhat selfishly, because there is a real tension within me right now. It's not one of those problems to solve. It's just a tension to manage, so to speak, to quote someone that I heard say that a number of years ago, that there is this tension between the forward movement into the new frontiers of our lives and just being with the people that we're with right now without agenda, without an ulterior motive, but to enjoy the presence of one another's company and the give and take that happens between two humans and the magic of the relationship.
Well, and that's one thing and I struggle with that too, because I'm definitely a type A personality and I'm a box checker.
Yeah, no, we couldn't tell it all, Dave.
Oh yeah, no, it's been tough is that I did worked on a kind of a couple business degrees that focused in on the wine industry and helping my family. And it's tough because that is a challenge, and it's a very competitive business, and medicine's a very competitive business, and I love giving whatever I give it all, and I want to be spent when I'm done at the end of my life, and really know that I didn't hold anything back. There's a book I read, and the premise at the end is die with you've shot your last arrow. I don't want to have anything left of the talents that I was given that I didn't use to the biggest capacity as possible. But then also I know that you only have, we talk about whether you're rich or poor, you have the same amount of time, but we forget you don't have the same amount of energy, and there's only a certain amount of energy. It's not just the time you spend with people, it's the quality of that time. And that's what I'm trying to really focus as my challenge, because I am spread so thin. I have had to say no to a lot more things in my life and back out of a lot more things to capture other things in my life that I feel are a deficit. And with that, living in the moment is one of it is just acknowledging it. My wife is so important, my children, my girlfriend, my grandmom, or whatever. And my father recently died, and now I'm living with my mother short term to help with her, and she's helping with me, and realize what I wouldn't give to have one more cup of coffee with my father. And I know what he would say as far as, again, as he would say, basically, your curtain call is closer than you think. Don't waste any of your time lamenting over me. You got work to do, and roll up your sleeves and get it done. And there'll be plenty of time in an eternity to have discourse, but it's tough, is staying focused on what really matters. And I think in this digitized world is one of the biggest things. They show that the average American, if you look at it, spends about 23 years of our life watching television or on the internet, and that about 4 years of that is just in commercials alone, which is a sad commentary. And I've seen with, that's something that's, I feel like our electronics can be great servants but terrible masters.
Thanks for wrestling with these questions with me in this conversation today, David, and so shedding some light from your own experience. And I just love people's stories, because every person's story has some extreme value in my story. And as I see the world through your eyes, I'm able to see the world a little bit differently and be enriched for it. And your story is going to fall on other people's ears and have an impact on them that is completely unique to them. And that's the wonder of our stories. And we are really wrestling with this reality of our mortality. And I think that's preferable and better than failing to wrestle with our mortality, because when we fail to wrestle with our mortality, that potentially we twiddle our thumbs to the grave, and that grave may be just a few feet away from us, or it might be just around the corner in tomorrow, or it may be many years down the road, who knows? But if we don't wrestle with it now, we will certainly wrestle with it when it happens. And if we only wrestle with it when it happens, then the opportunity to go back and change things in this life, at least, has passed. And my son said several years ago, in a quote that inspired the first episode of this podcast, he said, "Death brings meaning to life." And boy, does it. I mean, if it wasn't for our mortality, we wouldn't have this conversation, because each day would be without more or less value relative to the others. There would just be an endless string of things. But there is a finite number of days to life on this planet as we know it, which is why we're having this conversation, trying to figure out how to do the best with it that we can. And I think you've helped me, David, to think about it differently, and you're helping others as well. So thank you for your investment of time and energy today on behalf of this podcast and our listeners.
Well, and definitely I appreciate what you're doing, because when people fear death, which is inevitable, it paralyzes them and they become a spectator on the sidelines of their own life. That's the biggest thing. And you don't reach your true greatness. You can't maximize the person that you were meant to be here. And I really think that God expects greatness of all of us.
Hear, hear. All of you out there, remember, you are going to die, but you are not dead yet. So just like David is, and I'm giving it my best too, get after it. What will it take for you to take the reality of your mortality even more seriously and let it begin to change your life today? Don't let it take a crisis. Instead, create a life-saving crisis within yourself today by courageously embracing the mortality mindset. Commit to it as a discipline. With practice, we can approximate the impact of a real encounter with mortality by continually reminding ourselves of its inevitability and making day-to-day, real-world decisions in light of it. As David said, discipline is weighed in ounces, but regret is weighed in pounds. Here's one simple exercise to get you started. Read at least 10 obituaries from various sources. Mix it up. Read a few from the New York Times, a few from your local paper, and a few from small-town papers too. What sticks out to you? How does it affect you to read about other people's deaths and the lives they lived? Next, write your own obituary, as if you'd lived the best life you can imagine, a life you are immensely proud of. Then, begin to make adjustments in your life right now that will increase the likelihood that obituary will become a reality. This is your one and only life. Make it count. If this show has been meaningful to you, please rate it and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. Your feedback encourages others to tune in to this life-affirming, world-changing message. Connect with me to learn more about how a powerful, confidential one-on-one coaching partnership or participation in a graveyard group can help you live even more courageously and die regret-free. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.